Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is about pets in properties, essentially all you need to know. My name is Richard Abbots. I'm the founder at Inventory Hive. We're, for those of you that don't know, a cloud-based platform that produces property reports, paperless property reports with audit trail feedback for tenants to engage, etc. We also provide 360 virtual tours within our platform. And I'm joined by Michael Hill from TDS.
Morning.
So Michael, just maybe just give a little bit of brief background as well about your role at TDS.
Brilliant. Yeah, so my name is Michael Hill. I'm Assistant Head of Innovation at Tenancy Deposit Scheme. We're one of obviously the 3 TDP schemes operating across England and Wales. I've been with the organisation around 6 years, working initially within the dispute resolution function, both operationally and as an adjudicator. And since then, I've managed one of our dispute resolution schemes before moving into the innovation team, working more broadly on initiatives within the PRS. So I know that pets in properties has obviously been a talking point for a while now. So yeah, looking forward to an interesting session today.
Super, thanks, Michael. So just moving on to what we're actually going to cover in the webinar, just nice and briefly. So we're going to first of all look at an overview of the problem from different perspectives. So we've got the government perspective, the government's position, obviously that of landlords, property managers, and of course tenants as well. Of course, with that, we're going to look at the legal position. We're also going to look at the status quo. So what is commonly what approaches are commonly adopted in regards to pets on different sides. We're then going to talk with Michael. Michael's going to give his perspective from TDS as well about common claims that occur and how they're considered, which obviously helps for context to kind of put measures in place maybe to mitigate those risks. We're then going to, with Michael's help again, going to have a look at what you can claim for. And also as well, so as I've mentioned, how you can mitigate an evidence dispute. So some of that is perhaps the due diligence before a tenancy starts, as well as sort of during and after. So hopefully we can cover all bases in the session today. So it's also worth noting as well that I've just got a screen grab up here as well of your control panel for the webinar. So you'll note there's a couple of things worth mentioning. First of all, in the handout section, which you can see just here, you'll see that there's a PDF in there. So if you hit on your control panel on the right hand side and hit on that PDF, you'll be able to click on a link which you can then access maybe after the webinar. So if you maybe just want to download that PDF now so that it's on your computer or on your device, because then when the webinar finishes, you can pop your name and details in and it will send you 2 guides. So there's 2 free guides that accompany this webinar. One has been produced by Inventory Hive in collaboration with JMW Solicitors, and that covers lots of detail. It's a customizable guide as well. So you can essentially delete out the bits that refer to Inventory Hive, the first page and the last page. You can also pop your logo on there as well and then save it. So it's in a Word document format, which means you can pop your logo on it, save it as a PDF, and then of course share it with your landlords, which obviously shows that when it comes to pets in properties that you know your onions, as they say. Also as well, during the webinar, you can ask any questions that you like. Now, just in the interest of not disturbing the flow of the webinar, we're not going to take a pit stop to answer the questions. Ideally, we'd like to think that we've well thought out this webinar and we're going to cover off anything anyway. However, if you do submit a question, we will get back to you on it. We'll respond to each and every single question that comes in. If you just give us 24 to 48 hours in order to do that, we will respond to them separately via email after the webinar, any questions that you may have. So that covers all the housekeeping bits then. So without further ado, we'll jump into the main content of the webinar itself. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to start by looking at the overview of the problem. So in terms of statistics, there's an estimated 17 million, or in percentage terms, 59% of households are said to have pets in the UK. However, only 7% of landlords currently advertise their property as being pet friendly. So you've probably seen a lot of this stuff in the media, certainly over the last year and a half, 2 years during COVID times as well. ownership of pets being an ever-rising trend, as a result of the COVID pandemic, more needs to be done perhaps to alleviate landlords' concerns when it comes to renting out their property to animal owners. Of course, there's been a lot of influence in there from pressure groups as well, and there's some statistics in there as well that suggests looking at both sides of the coin is perhaps valuable. So, for instance, one of the surveys that we came across from the Cats Protection found that 75% of cat-friendly private landlords report no problems at all from cats in their property. The paper published by Advocates, which is a voluntary organisation supported by the NRLA and ARLA, reported that 53% of pet owners, including 57% of dog owners and 55% of cat owners, would be willing to take out pet insurance if required by a landlord. But as we're going to explore in a moment, insurance policies, there's lots of complexities that would need to be overcome for that to be a viable option. And at the moment, there is no real solution out there. So again, that provides a problem in regards to landlords feeling confident that they have the tools in place to mitigate risk in renting a property out to a tenant with pets. Also worth considering that the Tenant Fees Act 2019 placed a cap on deposits, meaning that the only real option available to landlords is to increase the rent. But of course, the tenant won't see that money again. So it could be argued that there's government failure occurring here, or perhaps unintended consequences resulting from the Tenant Fees Act. And then if you couple this as well with what happened earlier this year, in January 21, the government introduced a new standard tenancy agreement, which can be accessed online. Of course, it's also in the guidance that you can download with a webinar, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, that model tenancy agreement was introduced as a means of encouraging more landlords to provide pet-friendly accommodation for responsible pet owners. So in terms of the overview of the problem, just to summarise, in a nutshell, many landlords are reluctant to permit pets as they have no real way of mitigating the risk, which is partly due to the fact that the Tenant Fees Act imposes restrictions on the deposit amount. Of course, this can also lead to tenants not declaring pets in the first place for risk of being refused. And as I mentioned, insurance products are littered with complexities. So, for example, who takes out the policy, who makes the claim, how a claim's assessed. So there's lots of issues there, perhaps to be overcome for there to be viable insurance products out there to solve the problem. And of course, also the government's desire to address the issue, which, as we'll explore in a moment when we look at the legal position, there doesn't seem to be much desire from the government at this stage to go in, and change the deposit caps that are in place at the moment. So moving on to the next section then. So the actual legal position then. So there's a few topics to look at here as well, and some of which I'm sure landlords, property managers will already have some awareness of. But we thought if we can make this as comprehensive as possible. So I'm just going to run through the first 5 points here, and then in a minute Michael's going to cover off from the Tenant Fees Act perspective. So as things stand, landlords are not required to accept pets. That's worth setting the stall out initially. So they are free to advertise properties as being unsuitable for pets and to place clauses in their agreement stating that pets will not be permitted. If they allow pets, they can place reasonable limits on their continuing to live in the property. So this is subject to two limitations. So landlords must not carry out unlawful discrimination, which we're going to explore just now, in their refusal of pets. So there is also the effect of the Allotment Act 1950 to consider, which is also in the guidance that you can download as well. So the first bit worth noting is unlawful discrimination. So it is a relevant factor when it comes to pets. As you will have seen in the media as well, there is, particularly with COVID, a lot of pressure groups are quoting the positive mental health benefits of tenants being permitted to have pets. And on that note, it's worth looking at a case that went through the court. So in 2010, a tenant with mental health problems tried to argue that no animals term in her tenancy agreement breached the Disability Discrimination Act 1995. So that argument failed. The tenant appealed against her possession order, arguing that the covenant which prohibited pets discriminated against her on the grounds of disability. The court, however, ruled against her, finding that the no animals term did not make it impossible or unreasonably difficult for the tenant to enjoy the premises, and finding that there were no reasonable steps which the landlord should have taken but failed to take. Therefore, tenants will find it hard to argue that they should be able to keep pets to support or promote their mental health. However, some refusals of animals can be unlawful discrimination where they are fulfilling functions greater than that of a pet. So under the Equality Act 2010, landlords must make reasonable adjustments to avoid discriminating against tenants with a disability. So one example of a reasonable adjustment that a landlord may be required to make is to modify no pets policy for an assistance dog, maybe for somebody that maybe has epilepsy or has sight issues. So it is really important to consider that as well. Moving on to the next point, so dealing with unauthorised pets. So if a landlord finds that their tenant has got a pet or pets in breach of their tenancy agreement, so the issue I mentioned at the start of the webinar, whereby maybe the tenant doesn't declare it because they're obviously for fear of being refused, which is unfortunately, we're hearing that more commonly because of perhaps the failures within policy at the moment. So it's worth noting then, so if a landlord finds that their tenant has got a pet or pets in breach of their tenancy agreement, then their ability to do something about it may be limited. Eviction for breach of a pet prohibition is a discretionary ground for possession. So it will be necessary to convince the court that the prejudice to the landlord of allowing the pet to stay will be greater than the prejudice to the tenant caused by losing their home. So whether the court can be convinced to make a possession order will be dependent on the facts. If the tenant's pet has caused serious damage, which is likely to use up all of the deposit or repair or even exceed it, then the court is likely to give possession. A similar attitude will prevail if the pet was a source of antisocial behaviour. If there is other prohibition that is being breached, such as a restriction in the lease of a flat which prohibits pets, then this is likely to lead to a possession being granted. So other than these situations, it is unlikely that possession will be granted, as the court is likely to take the view that any restitution required can be dealt with through the tenancy deposit. If a landlord finds a tenant with a pet, they should take legal advice. A stern letter coupled with a formal notice may lead to them removing the pet, even if the landlord is not likely to obtain possession in a court. So that kind of concludes from the perspective of dealing with unauthorised pets. And hopefully kind of gives a bit of perspective on that. So the next bit, which again we touched on briefly in the intro of the webinar, was in relation to the model tenancy agreement. So on the 28th of January 21, the government introduced a new standard tenancy agreement, which can be found online. The model tenancy agreement was introduced as a means of encouraging more landlords to provide pet-friendly accommodation for responsible pet owners. So the actual clause in there is clause 1.5. And to quote that, it states, a tenant must seek the prior consent of the landlord should they wish to keep pets or other animals at the property. A landlord must not unreasonably withhold or delay a written request from a tenant without considering the request on its own merits. The landlord should accept such a request where they are satisfied the tenant is a responsible pet owner and the pet is of a kind that is suitable in relation to the nature of the premises at which it will be kept. Consent is deemed to be granted unless the written consent is turned down by a landlord with good reason in writing within 28 days of receiving the request. A landlord is prohibited from charging a fee to a tenant who wishes to keep pets or other animals at the property. Permission may be given on the condition that the tenant pays an additional reasonable amount towards the deposit, but the deposit must not breach the deposit cap requirements under the Tenant Fees Act 2019. So, the model tenancy agreement there is perhaps counterintuitive with the suggestion that it should be considered within the deposit, because prior to the Tenant Fees Act, of course, it could be that a landlord or an agent advises that a pet deposit is taken, but of course, with the arrival of the Tenant Fees Act, that's that option's been removed. And there's other information within that model tenancy agreement as well, guidance notes which confirm landlords can no longer exercise a blanket ban on pets. the default position is that landlords consent to keeping the pet unless otherwise stated in writing within 28 days of request. So one really important aspect with this, of course, is that although the model tenancy agreement is the government's recommended contract for landlords, it is important to remember that this is not legally binding on landlords, and use of the agreement is completely voluntary. So this means that landlords can still legally ban pets at their property at this time, despite this being advised against. Moving on to the final part of the legal position from my perspective, before I hand over to Michael to talk about the Tenant Fees Act, we're just going to touch also upon the Dogs and Domestic Animals Accommodation and Protection Bill. So for those who believe that the model pets clause does not go far enough, there is currently a private members bill in circulation which aims to establish a legal right for residential tenants to keep dogs and other animals in rented property. So although the purpose of the private members bill are ultimately to change the law, in practice, obviously only a tiny minority of these bills do in fact become law. They can, however, be effective at generating publicity around the issue and have the potential to influence legislation indirectly. It is likely that there will be a drive to place provisions about pets into the forthcoming government white paper on tenancies and possibly into any resulting legislation. However, nothing in the government's approach to date suggests that they favour any compulsion on landlords to permit pets in their properties. So that's enough for me. I can breathe now and hand you over to Michael on the Tenant Fees Act 2019.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So you've touched on it a couple of times actually. The Tenant Fees Act obviously came into effect in 2019. It capped tenancy deposits at 5 weeks rent for tenancies where the annual rent was up to 50k, or 6 weeks rent where the annual rent was 50,000 or more. The legislation made no reference to pet deposits, which were commonly taken pre-legislation, as many people will know, and these would commonly be an additional 1 week's rent in return for the tenant being able to keep a pet in the property. And at the end of the tenancy, it would specifically be used in the event that the pet had caused damage to the property, for example, or that the carpets required cleaning. So it's quite a clean way of the tenant saying, I recognise I'm having a pet, I'll pay an extra week's rent, and that can be used if there's any damage or cleaning required. The Tenant Fees Act was obviously intended to reduce upfront costs and fees to tenants, so it prohibited all fees associated with the granting, renewal or termination of a tenancy, other than those which were explicitly permitted within the legislation. And I think the issue is obviously, given that deposits were capped and pet deposits were basically outlawed, the result was inadvertently, as you've mentioned, Richard, been that landlords are less inclined to allow tenants to keep pets, or they increase the rent, and often that increased rent, which obviously isn't refundable to the tenant, will cost the tenant more over a 1, 2, even 3 year tenancy than the original 1 week extra pet deposit would have. So the tenant's actually in a position where they have less tools at their disposal to incentivise a landlord to allow them to keep a pet, and if they do manage it, it could cost them more in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that, Michael. So that concludes the legal position section of the webinar. Just at this point as well, I just wanted to thank J&W solicitors for helping us with the research of the content here. As I said a moment ago as well, a lot of this content is summarised within the guidance, the free downloads that you can access from the PDF in your control panel. So I suppose that this next section, the current status quo, just kind of summarises really what we've already been going through in the webinar. So, from the government's perspective, their position in regards to pets is quite clear, that that they would recommend that landlords, property managers, agents, put measures in place, to allow pets in properties where it is suitable. So obviously the legal position is that that landlords aren't obliged to do that, but quite clearly with some of the members bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, the model tenancy agreement, is quite clear that their position is that they could move towards having something in place. And obviously with the white paper that's underway and being reviewed this year, there could be some changes there. So, perhaps it could be an opportunity for landlords, agents and property managers who are quite rightly, have some trepidation in whether they should allow pets within their property, because of course there are risks associated with damage, condition, cleanliness, which we're going to cover off in just a moment as well. Maybe they should perhaps look towards having policies and processes in place that allow for potential tenants with pets to be screened, by having processes in place, and we'll talk about that as well in a moment, where we look at sort of pet policies and CVs and that kind of thing as well. So, and obviously from a tenant's perspective as well, as we quoted from the statistic at the start of the webinar, there's a huge percentage of tenants out there that have pets, and of course, going back to the point I made a moment ago, for landlords and agents, it would perhaps be a little bit remiss to exclude the tenants out there that could be absolutely fantastic tenants, but obviously have a pet. So you don't necessarily want to exclude those good tenants just because they have a pet. But equally, from a landlord agent perspective as well, it just feels as though there perhaps should be better tools in place for them to be able to protect themselves, because it seems to be somewhat lacking at the moment, particularly on the back of the Tenant Fees Act 2019. So okay, so I'll hand over to you now, Michael, on that note as well, to talk about sort of common claims that occur and how they're considered.
Perfect, thanks, Richard. So yeah, in terms of deductions for damage caused by pets, I think the most common claims we've got up on screen are cleaning, especially to carpets, removal of fouling in gardens, damage to skirting boards or doors where a pet has maybe chewed or scratched the doors, and things like frayed carpet. So I think, as you say, it's important to note that this is not in every case. Many pets are well behaved, and I'm sure there are many cases where no deductions from the deposit are necessary. I don't have the figures to hand, but we actually don't see a lot of deposit disputes which are solely down to pet damage. I think that where a landlord allows a tenant to keep a pet, the landlord is often expecting a slightly higher level of wear, and in the majority of cases, any wear or tear falls within that. It is, as I say, wear and tear rather than damage. With regards to the common claims, carpet cleaning is the obvious one. This could be due to either fouling from the pet, if it maybe isn't trained, or it's a puppy, for example, or simply cleaning because there's a pet odor or excessive pet hair left behind. Some dogs in particular and cats moult a bit. In such cases, I think a landlord is entitled to claim as long as it's supported by evidence. So you're looking for the check-in report to say that the carpets were clean, that there was no odour, that there was no hair, and at the end of the tenancy there is. So the adjudicator could make a clear distinction that that's arisen during the tenancy from the pet.
Yeah,
And the other area.
Sorry, Michael. Just hold on. I was just thinking. Just wanted to jump in on that bit as well. So, from a perspective of actually creating the report as well. Obviously, at Inventory Hive, that's what we do as a platform. And one of the things that I see quite a lot, and I don't feel that it's necessarily the best way to approach it, is sometimes inventory reports will say it's good cleanliness and condition unless otherwise stated. Now, from my perspective, I feel that particularly with templates that you can have when you set up a report, I think it's much better to be very, very explicit on that initial inventory. So, for example, you use the example here of doors. If on doors you were to say, free of scratches, marks, front, side, and reverse, that makes it very explicit, so that when the tenant moves in and they have the opportunity to engage and feedback, and they do that via a web page, often on their smartphone, when it's triggered from our platform, if when they look at that door there is a scratch on it or there's an issue, they can add a comment and take a photo, which of course all gets audit trailed. Now, if you are a tenant reading that report and it isn't explicit, and you're relying on something on the first page that says it's good and clean unless otherwise stated, and they don't engage with it and they don't look at it, that's where you kind of run the risk of having that dispute at checkout, where they say, oh, it was like that when I moved in. And that's why I think it is much better to be very explicit. And I'm not suggesting that on every single item someone has to mindlessly stand there and describe that. But a templated approach when setting up a report can kind of say things like the ceiling's free of marks and mold, the walls are free of scuffs and marks, the doors free of scratches, etc. You can add that finer detail when you're actually compiling the report. But that's certainly the approach that we've chosen to adopt, because of course it makes it more transparent, the before and the after, which means that if you do want to make a claim, whether it's caused by a human or caused by a pet, it's easier to kind of follow that stuff up.
Yeah, of course. No, I completely agree. I think, the less ambiguity in your report, the better. The clearer it is that, something was undamaged, that it was clean. There's a clearer evidence trail for at the end of the tenancy. And as you say, it brings me on to, damage to skirting boards and doors. They are, with regards to pets, in particular, some of the more common claims that we see, especially with dogs. You see that, they sometimes chew on the skirting boards or the lower part of the door, especially when they're a puppy or when they're untrained. And this, it simply is damage. It's avoidable. And I think that in cases where clear evidence is provided to show this type of damage, the adjudicator would be making an award to compensate the landlord for the loss in value. So it's often not enough to justify, I guess, a replacement door, for example, but it may be repairable through sanding and repainting, or the landlord may be seeking compensation for the loss in value given the marks made by the pet. So this type of claim, I think, highlights, as you say, the importance of detailing condition at the start of the tenancy. There may be marks present at checkout, and the adjudicator just needs to see that door or that skirting board were not damaged at the start of the tenancy. And then, as you say, it's neither here nor there whether it was a dog or a cat or a human. That's damage to the property, which is a breach of the tenancy agreement, and therefore a compensatory award can be made.
Yeah. Okay.
Finally,
so I suppose that's kind of all embroiled within this one as well, isn't it, in terms of sort of what you can claim for?
Yeah. I think the final one, garden maintenance, as I said, I think I've touched on it. It's dogs fouling in the garden often, which it can damage the lawn long term, or it simply needs removal. So it's just important that the tenant picks that up throughout the tenancy. In terms of what you can claim for, like I said, it brings me on to this. You can obviously claim for cleaning and damage, as I've just discussed, those types of things which are evidenced clearly by the check-in and check-out report. The tenancy agreement will hopefully set out that the property must be returned clean to the same standard as at check-in, and the property must be returned with no damage, making allowance obviously for fair wear and tear across the course of the tenancy. And undertaking a thorough check-in report and providing this to the tenant for comment, undertaking a comparable, comprehensive checkout report should be enough to protect the landlord at the end of the tenancy if the property is left unclean or damaged in any way. So it will then be a case of proposing these deductions to the tenant, communicating with your tenant and setting out why these deductions are being made, where you think that damage has been caused, giving them a chance to comment, and obviously in the event that you can't reach an agreement, submitting a dispute to your TDP scheme. The second point on this slide here about any other breach of the agreement is quite a broad one, and the reason being is that, as I said earlier, whilst the landlord cannot take a pet deposit, they are still able to claim against the security deposit for 5 weeks or 6 weeks rent based on the annual rent. That security deposit is based on the overarching obligations set out in the tenancy agreement. So a stained carpet, for example, is a stained carpet, irrespective of whether it's muddy due to the tenant walking into the property with shoes on, or due to mud being carried in by a pet. So in both cases, TDS would be checking that there's an obligation to keep the property clean, the carpet's clean, checking the carpets were clean at the start of the tenancy using the check-in report, and checking that the carpets were unclean at the end of the tenancy using the check-out report. So in such cases, a landlord's claim for cleaning of this carpet, it would be successful. It's not actually they're not detrimented by the fact that they can't take a pet deposit. I know that it's not ideal, but actually their claim for cleaning of the carpet would be successful, whether that carpet was unclean due to a human or due to a pet. So I think the real protection for a landlord comes from the tenancy agreement, a really good tenancy agreement, which places clear obligations on the tenant to look after the property. And as long as the tenancy sets out those obligations along with the deposit use clause, they should be able to submit a claim if the worst should happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of just moving on to the next, so in terms of, sort of mitigating and evidencing disputes as well, I suppose there's different phases throughout a tenancy cycle. So you've kind of got pre-tenancy, and that's maybe doing that that screening, that referencing process, which obviously generally happens anyway, looking at obviously the tenant's income, ability to pay, etc., etc. There's also some other approaches that can be taken as well. I mean, in terms of a pet policy, so one option available, to landlords is to provide pet-owning tenants with a detailed pet policy, which perhaps sets out the conditions by which the tenant is allowed to keep pets at the property. So that could request things like a reference for the pets from a previous landlord or a vet, information about the pets. So it could, obviously what bears relevance here is the number of pets. Is it a small dog? Is it a big dog? What's the breed of the pet? Who's the nominated person to take care of the pet in case of an emergency? Confirmation that the pets are being fully vaccinated and are regularly treated for things like fleas. Also, whether or not the pets are not a breed listed on the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. Confirmation that the tenant will seek the landlord's prior written consent before moving any additional pet into the property. So, as you mentioned a moment ago, Michael, in regards to the tenancy agreement, there's also considering pet policies in there as well. And I think sometimes it's about setting expectations and being very explicit as to what is and what is not acceptable. In terms of pet references as well, it might sound a little bit extreme, because it's not like someone's going to go and interview a dog. It's a bit ridiculous, but there are some simple things that can be done there. So a non-exhaustive list of questions that referees may be asked to answer. How long did the tenant live at the previous property with their pet? Which pets did they own at the time? During that period you're getting a reference for. So obviously it's important to make sure that the reference, and I don't quite know how you would achieve this, but to ensure that the reference that you received for the said pet from the previous property is the same pet that's going into the incoming property. Does the referee consider the tenant to be a responsible pet owner? Were the pets well behaved? Did they cause any damage? And if so, what damage? I suppose when you look at it like that, some of these questions are pretty common sense, but again, that's why we put the guide together, and there are sort of checklists in there that can be used. And then, I suppose finally, in terms of mitigating and evidencing disputes, which we touched upon before, it's about having, a very clear inventory that's very explicit in terms of the written descriptions, also photos as well. If there's a pet going into a property, it's maybe wise to pay particular attention to the cleanliness of carpets, odours in rooms, if it's furnished, the same again. Outlining those expectations of condition and cleanliness. If the property was professionally cleaned beforehand, do you have receipts? It's about being able to evidence these things. And as I suggested before, perhaps not relying too much on, it's good and clean and etc. unless otherwise stated. I do think that you should pay particular attention to issues that can, become common disputes. So things like, there's no, the seasonal order of the garden is in, good condition. There's no pet fouling present, or and having photos to back that kind of stuff up as well. So, also, obviously, from that's the inventory perspective. You've also, of course, got routine visits, interim inspections, or midterms, whichever you like to call them, and that's, of course, about making sure that there aren't any breaches evident to the tenancy. Which obviously, if a pet wasn't permitted, are there signs of a pet within a property? Those are the things that would need to be checked. And of course, the checkout again is about being very, very sort of explicit against sort of before and after. So that kind of, that does conclude the webinar for today. I mean, Michael, do you have anything you wanted to add about the mitigating and evidencing disputes part?
No, like I say, I think it's a really interesting topic. There's a lot of solutions being discussed within the market, like you say, pet CVs, pet references. There's been calls for pet deposits to be made legal again, or for an insurance product. And I think at the end of the day, TDS in particular are advocates for finding a solution which makes the renting process easier for both parties. So we would like to see a solution which obviously allows tenants to keep pets in properties, but also recognises that a landlord is taking on a larger risk by allowing a tenant to keep a pet, and it's fair that the landlord is protected against any additional damage to that property. So, like I say, it's an interesting topic, and I think that hopefully this webinar has provided people with a bit of guidance on the background and the legal position and what to do if the worst should happen and they end up in a claim. And as you say, hopefully some questions come in and we can come back on them and provide some further guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that concludes the webinar for today. Michael, thank you so much for your time, as always.
Thanks for having
We
me.
look forward to jumping on another event soon with you.
Perfect.
All right, mate.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, take care of yourself.
Bye bye.
See you. Bye.